Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Though parties that are not directly concerned with the South China Sea issue, the US, Japan and Australia have recently released a joint statement on the issue claiming the Hague arbitration ruling should be final and legally binding. China has refuted the statement, saying it is only fanning the flames of regional tensions. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said now is the time to test whether they are peacekeepers or troublemakers. Who are the troublemakers in the South China Sea? What is Japan's motivation in getting actively involved? And did Australia make a wise move by taking sides on this issue? To answer these questions and more, we are joined in the studio by Anna Tangen, author and columnist from the United States, and Teng Jianqun, Director of the Department of American Studies with the China Institute of International Studies. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
In a jointly issued trilateral statement, the US, Japan and Australia called on China not to build military outposts in the South China Sea. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has refuted the statement, saying if the three countries have genuine concerns about the issue, they should support the declaration on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea issued by ASEAN and China, and show whether they are peacekeepers or agitators. On the same day, foreign ministers of China and the ASEAN countries vowed to promote peace in the South China Sea in a joint statement issued following their meeting, showing that the countries in the region intend to deepen cooperation and hope to move away from the South China Sea issue.
The joint statement issued after the ASEAN-China ministerial meeting points out that the countries should fully implement the declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea. This shows the importance of negotiating and solving the South China Sea issue through peaceful means, so as to promote cooperation in various fields in the region.
The US Secretary John Kerry said the United States won't take sides in territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and stressed the importance of initiating negotiations among claimants during his recent visit to the Philippines. Some experts in China have said they believe the trilateral statement has been mainly provoked by Japan, which has territorial disputes with China in the East China Sea. Some Australian media have also expressed their concerns about the current government's intention of supporting the US and Japan on this issue. They said Australia should tread carefully over the South China Sea ruling. As China is Australia's biggest trading partner, it's no good for Australia's economy if bilateral relations deteriorate.
Gentlemen, let's take a look at this issue. Is it an issue of leveling the playing field? For example, if the United States, along with two other allies, Japan and Australia, accuse China of militarizing the outpost in the South China Sea, why don't they also point their fingers to Vietnam and the Philippines, the other claimants, to dismantle their military facilities in the South China Sea so that China could follow suit?
This is actually a double standard in policy by the three countries and the United States. Of course, even John Kerry, the Secretary of State, gave his statement that the United States will never take position on the ruling. But after the briefing, I think the three countries just issued the joint statement. To my knowledge, actually, the statement was drafted by the Japanese diplomat and touched upon the issue in the South China Sea and saying the ruling should be abided by the relevant countries. This is actually a double standard by the countries concerned.
Well, to my knowledge, government officials in the White House somehow indicated before that other claimants should do the same, so that the United States could, its presence, military presence, could be justified in patrolling the waters, because China insisted that all parties concerned in the game should follow the same code of conduct, right?
Yeah. Well, what you have is countries that are pursuing very their own game, in essence. You have Japan, which is very interested in, quote, normalizing its military using the South China Sea island dispute as a way to say that we need to be tough militarily. You have the US, who's concerned about the rise of China, and they're pushing your buttons, and very successfully. I mean, now all of these issues, when China gets very upset about these things, this is a signal to the rest of ASEAN and everything that China is trying to do economically, that China can't be trusted, and this is what the US is trying to do. The puzzling part is what Australia is doing. They have consistently always said that we will not take sides. It's not in our interest. We have, yes, and we're allied to the U.S. on one hand, but we trade and we make money in Asia, and especially with China. So this is, Julie Bishop's statement was absolutely bizarre in a way, because she's acting against self-interest.
What do you think of the danger of extending the forefront of a U.S.-Japan security accord from Diaoyu Islands and the nearby waters to the South China Sea? They have seriously extended their forward military presence from Northeast Asia to the South China Sea, and that has helped build a new Iron Curtain. What do you think of this allegation?
I think this is actually a policy adopted by the United States and also by Japan this time to try to have a connection between the two seas, I mean the South China Sea and the Eastern China Sea. And at this moment, especially when we look at the policy of Japan, we can find Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, repeatedly mentioned the trouble made by China in the South China Sea and the Eastern China Sea, and also Japan encouraged the G7 at least twice, to issue a statement to saying that the maritime security and the trouble made by the Chinese government should be very careful, and should be have a good look at these activities by the Chinese in the military presence in the South China Sea and in Eastern China Sea. So I think this is actually a game played by Shinzo Abe. They try to manipulate the contradiction there so they can have good execution to deploy more advanced weapon system in this region.
Well, I see it just slightly differently, but very cynically also. From this perspective, this is a man who's gotten his majority in the upper house, which will allow him to amend the Constitution in order to make rearm Japan. But his economic policies have not worked. The Bank of Japan has not been able to stem things. They're throwing more money after things. And the question is he trying to use this nationalistic card to take away the internal interests of people away from his failures economically? And this is a very, very dangerous kind of precedent.
Yeah, there's of course a strong element of domestic politics for LDP to make use of South China Sea tensions and to amend the pacifist constitution. Let's look at how and why the trilateral statement has been issued by the United States, Japan, and Australia. On the same day this trilateral statement was issued, the 6th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting announced a joint statement on fully and effectively implementing the declaration on the conduct in the South China Sea. Now there's a big difference between this trilateral statement and the joint statement by ASEAN. Do you believe, therefore, that this trilateral statement is actually a reflection of the failure of the American diplomacy, because it has failed to persuade ASEAN as a regional bloc to adopt the American position? It ended up adopting a trilateral statement to show, hey, after all, we are here. We must show our leadership here in this region.
Yeah, you're right. I think early this year, I mean in February, the U.S. also, called a summit in Sunnyland in California, 10+1, then 10 ASEAN countries and the United States there. And the United States Special President Obama, pursued all the member states in ASEAN. They should, put together and to join together and to maintain the peace and stability in the South China Sea, to, resist all the, activities from the Chinese side. Actually, only the then Filipino leader Aquino III gave some echo to this requirement from the United States. The other countries, in ASEAN country, they did not give any response or echo to the requirement from the United States.
But I'm afraid this echo by Aquino III, the former president of the Philippines, has unfortunately been reversed by his successor, President Duterte. And therefore, let's go back a little bit to the what the joint statement of ASEAN says, and also a similar one between China and the 10 member states of ASEAN. Those documents say clearly that parties concerned should work together in protecting freedom of navigation and overflight. Don't you think at the same time Secretary Kerry and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi also said this page should be turned? And there's already a consensus, if it can be called a consensus among parties concerned, that diplomacy should first and foremost be the very first tool to be employed. Instead of imposing pressure on China through yet another statement, the so-called trilateral statement.
Well, the facts speak for themselves, Yang Rui. I mean, they made the statement. It was obviously aimed at provoking China, and it has succeeded. We're talking about this today because it's become an issue. But I think there's something more involved in this. And this is the legalistic view of the world, which is adopted by the West. You know, you have all these precedents, winner, loser in the court. All right, or arbitration, whatever it is, and the Eastern view, which is about consensus, right? We get together, if we can all agree, then we agree, and we have no problem. Now, when you try to mix these things, I think what you get is exactly what happened. All right, you have the group saying, look, as Asians, we believe in consensus agreements because there really is no alternative. The legalistic side does not work because there's no enforcement mechanism. And when you start piling on pressure, all you're going to end up doing is exacerbating the situation. You're not moving towards resolution, you're moving towards conflict.
Ruling of the arbitration, ironically, does not have any legal binding enforcement power, and therefore, why do you think the United States align itself with Australia and Japan to execute the ruling? The ruling itself is not legally binding, but of course Julia Bishop, our Foreign Minister of Australia, said this is the final, this is the legally binding.
Yeah,
we see conflicting points.
Yeah, actually, as some Chinese scholars argue, this is actually a war of a legal war between China and the claimants, and with the support from the United States. I think at least 4 reasons why this time John Kerry gave such a statement that the United States would never take position on the ruling. The first is that the ruling actually is a very ridiculous word, including the turning of Taiping Island into a rock. And it's ridiculous. And the second reason is the President Obama actually only has 5 months in office. And I don't think he would like to be involved in some large scale of war intention in this region.
Oh, by the way, the Taiping Island, which is claimed by by Taiwan authorities, may have become a part of the domestic politics of Taiwan because the newly elected leader of Taiwan, Madame Tsai Ing-wen, did not allow any Taiwanese citizens to go to Taiping Island to show their determination in protection of this big rock, quote unquote. So is that a sign, a strong sign by Tsai Ing-wen to yield to pressure from Japan? Because in the blood of DPP, the pro-secession party of Taiwan, all generations of the leadership of this party have developed a very strong relationship with Japan.
Yeah, well, but this is the irony. Here's a party that calls itself a nationalist party that says that Taiwan is independent and we want to protect it and things like that. But when it comes over to this thing, now they're caught. But they're in a very difficult situation, much like Australia. They are in a situation where economically they're very intertwined with mainland China, and yet they're trying to back away from that. I still come back to this issue that I don't understand what Julie Bishop is hoping to gain by doing this.
I promise to come back and examine why Australia has adopted such a hawkish position on the South China Sea. You are watching Dialogue with Teng Yanquan and Anna Tanga. We are discussing the trilateral statement issued by the United States, Australia, and China to enforce the so-called ruling of the arbitration tribunal. We'll be back in a short while. Welcome back. Anna, the United States is not a party to UNCLOS. Why is it so proactively involved in the design and execution of the so-called ruling of the arbitral tribunal?
Well, this is one of the most serious hypocrisies that is being pushed aside. I mean, by making a statement about enforcing something that you're not part of, it really should open up people to saying, well, why? Now, why did the U.S. not join UNCLOS? Very simple. It was not prepared to allow its sovereign issues to be settled in a court in Europe, period. And this is still the position today, and this is why it's never been passed and will never be passed because of that. Now, ironically, they're saying that the same process should be allowed when it comes to China. So it's really very questionable whether or not the U.S. should be involved in this, especially since they say we're not taking a position and we're not part of UNCLOS.
Wait a minute, Anna. The arbitration tribunal is said not to have any right to interfere or address the issue of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And your allegation that the United States will not allow its sovereign issues to be addressed in Europe through UNCLOS or other forms of arbitration, and therefore they have the right to step in.
Yeah.
There was that article in there that talked about the possibility of mandatory arbitration. All right, but it was never intended to be part of it. It was inserted in by the Europeans because they were concerned that the U.S. would ignore many of these rulings and that they would go beyond that. There was also some concerns about bringing environmental cases, which had nothing to do with this. If you look at other parts of UNCLOS and how it was done in 1982, they said specifically, we will not get involved, all right, in issues of sovereignty. But when you go forward today, you had 5 judges picked by a Japanese chief judge to determine the fate of China in a dispute that it did not recognize and bring as an arbitration. This is not a court of law, but it's trying to act like one.
The point of double standards on the ruling of arbitration tribunal perhaps it could also be attributed to the 1986 ruling about Nicaragua.
Yeah.
The United States also refused to comply with the ruling. And yet Australians and Japanese refused to say anything about whether this is legally binding, whether this is final.
Actually, there was some condemnation internationally, and it stirred up a lot of ire at an arrogant U.S. from that perspective. It was not our finest moment.
And one article from perhaps one of the European countries has said recently that none of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council would be willingly complying with any rulings of the international arbitration. Having said this, there have been unofficial discussions about a proposed joint patrol by Japan and the United States in the South China Sea. Will that be viewed as very provocative? And what do you think will be the worst case scenario as a result?
Actually, the Japanese self-defense forces, including the maritime self-defense force, already be involved in the patrolling in the South China Sea. But this time, only some individual, fighting ships, and also the Coast Guard of Japan has already been involved in the training of the Coast Guard to some relevant countries, especially with the Philippines. They also, did a joint drill just around the ruling issued, on 12 July last month. So actually, Japanese maritime forces already there, and the issue: can Japan join the task force, of the United States to do the so-called freedom of navigation? This is a very, you mentioned, a very provocative action if the Japanese side does such a way.
How do you foresee a vicious cycle should such a joint patrol take place in the South China Sea between Japan and the United States? Then China would do something in response, and that will fuel the speculation that the pacifist constitution is likely to be amended in favor of what Shinzo Abe wants.
Well, I think it's going to be amended either way, but I agree with you. But the ratcheting is going up on both sides. All right, there's a live fire drill going on in the East China Seas. Russia and China will be doing a joint exercise in a week or so. And what you see here is, unfortunately, I do believe that the U.S. is deliberately pushing China's buttons on this particular issue as a way of weakening your economic agenda. And I mean this in the sense that China is dependent. It is really the one who is dependent on trade coming in. The resources which make products which are then shipped out are all brought in from overseas. If you cut that off or you endanger it, you're not endangering the United States, you're endangering China. and by virtue of that, the domestic situation here. So I think there are those people in the U.S. that see this as a way of destabilizing and curtailing China.
In fact, you are emphasizing a point quite in favor of the Chinese position on protecting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. China is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the existing regional economic order. We really want to value the existing freedom of navigation and overflight. Having said this, what do you think of Australia? At the beginning of our discussion, Anna said he was seriously puzzled as to why Australians, Aussies, have been so actively involved and why there's such a bold decision by Julia Bishop, the Foreign Minister of Australia, to align herself with the United States and Japan. Australia is, after all, China is the biggest trading power of Australia.
Yeah, Australia is a very specific country in Asia Pacific region, and I'm sure in recent 100 years has been a very good follower of the United States, and Australia participated in almost all the war carried out by the United States. 100 years ago in Europe and recently in the Middle East. This is a country very special, and on one side, it heavily relies on the security protection from the United States. The recent discussion is about the deployment of a B-1B bomber from the United States in Australia, and also in the Marine Corps in Darwin port. And on the other side, it's very tricky. The Australian government, various governments from some other countries and to Australia, they all attach great importance to the economic cooperation with China, China's big market and China's trade, and Australia and China also established the FTA. So this is a very specific country. It's a tradition for Australian to be involved in the competition or in the tension initiated by the United States.
It comes as no surprise that Australia would always come across as one of the closest allies of the United States in the world or in the South Pacific region. What about the strong feedback from mainland China? Let's look at editorials of Global Times, one of the leading newspapers that enjoy very big circulation here because of its reputation as a nationalist newspaper. Now, two issues. One, Anna, having lived here in China as an observer of China's domestic politics and diplomacy, don't you think our decision-making is increasingly held hostage by the rise of nationalism? And B, do you think the media would indeed contribute to decision-making or formulation of a very tough foreign policy? Because these editorials of Global Times suggested that South Korea and Australia should be both punished for their decision in either the regard of a THAAD deployment or, in the case of Australia, they join the United States in issuing the trilateral statement and perhaps they join the patrol, first of all.
This is actually a very interesting topic we are going to discuss. I think the media actually play a very important role in the decision making, no matter it's a good decision or bad decision. And actually the game played in the South China Sea has already become a media war. The media try to manipulate for the popularity in China. Newspaper, the television show, they all talk about the dispute in the South China Sea. Actually, in terms of the military-to-military interaction, I think I met Swift, the 7th Fleet commander in Australia. I think 3 months ago, and I asked him a question. Your task force of aircraft carrier battle group was surrounded by the Chinese fighting ship. He said yes. And I asked, what is your response to these activity between the two militaries? He said the action and reaction are very professional and very positive. So the military actually, they have good communication.
So it's a game.
Side. It's a game played by the public, by the politicians, and also by the media.
What do you think of the position of Global Times? We have to spend a few minutes before we wrap up this discussion about the South China Sea. The Global Times says Australia is not a paper tiger, it's just a paper cat. And it also criticized India and South Korea for whatever disputes that have occurred between China and our neighboring countries.
Well, I see it as the opposite of constructive. I mean, often China has been the country that said, let's calm down, let's not inflame tensions, let's figure out a way to solve this. I don't think naming people as your enemy is going to make them your friend. So in the long run, these kinds of journalistic attacks are actually counterproductive for China. And nationalism is not just an issue in China, it is worldwide. And unfortunately, one country becomes nationalistic and it is infectious. It goes across the world. You're seeing this with Donald Trump, you're seeing this in many other countries, and this is not the way that the world could go forward in a peaceful and peaceful trading and prosperity means.
A few days from now, in fact, on Friday, the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games will take place in Brazil. Don't you think there's going to be a drop in temperature over the South China Sea? Because public attention will be diverted from South China Sea to how many medals Chinese team will win. Because Dai Bingguo, former state councillor, said it's time to introduce a drop in the temperature instead of fueling the heat there.
Yeah, I think after this round of competition, especially after the ruling of the arbitration issued last month, the parties concerned have already returned to the original point that all agreed, including the claimants, in the South China Sea. They all agreed to continue their negotiation dialogue directly with the relevant countries. So this is actually returning to the original point.
Yes, except you have this trilateral statement which seems completely out of character with the idea that you're trying to lessen tensions between these claimants.
So it's a game and it's a show, it's a lot of theater perhaps. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation in this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.